Hey there, this is Dan. I'm the producer of the Rhodes Center podcast. If you like this show, we highly recommend you check out the Watson Institute's other podcast, Trending Globally. On it, you'll hear more in-depth conversations about politics and policy from some of the world's leading experts, including occasionally from our very own Mark Blythe. You can find it by subscribing to Trending Globally on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, that's Trending Globally. All right, on with the show. Thanks.
Welcome to the Rhodes Centre podcast. My name is Mark Blythe. I'm the director of the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance at Brown University. This week on the Rhodes Centre podcast, we have Jonathan Hopkin, who's a professor at the London School of Economics. Jonathan's just brought out a book called Anti-System Politics: The Crisis of Market Liberalism and the Rich Democracies. Unlike most commentaries and analyses of populism and the breakdown of party systems, Jonathan has a particular explanation based upon, as the title says, or the subtitle says, in the crisis of market liberalism. That is the way that we have been governing our economies and running our economies for the past 30 years, really explains not just populism, but the rise of a distinct anti-system politics. It was great to have a discussion with him on the pod. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi, how are you doing?
Not bad. How's merry old England?
It's ridiculously warm. There are wildfires in Lincolnshire.
Wow. And you had I think it was the driest or warmest spring since records began?
That sounds about right. After raining all winter, like the worst for 30 years, we've now probably had the driest spring for about as long.
Wow, interesting times. So speaking of volatility, you wrote a book about it, only in politics. Anti-System Politics: The Crisis of Market Liberalism and Rich Democracies. I've known a lot about this book since its inception, and I want to have you on the pod because I think it's a very important contribution, not just to political science, literature on parties and populism and all the rest of it, but because you really take a particular angle which I think a lot of people will find interesting. So let's start at the beginning with this. This is a book about populism qua the fact that lots of parties and party systems have transformed very much over the past 10 years. You trace the causes of that back further than 10 years and basically implicate, if you will, neoliberalism as a project in the transformation of these party systems. As such, Trump, Brexit and all the stuff that people are focusing on just now have much longer run causes. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. Although it's true that sort of shorter run causes, like especially the financial crisis, gives a big push to these processes. But the roots lie way back in the 70s, early 80s, really, in most countries, when this shift away from what we could call democratic capitalism starts. So governments start thinking about the economy as something to be that the governments need to oversee rather than manage. And the idea of the economy having to work for all people takes a secondary role.
So before delving into that, let's just start at the basics. Why anti-system politics? Why not populist politics? What are you saying with this notion of anti-system?
Well, apart from anything else, the word populism is really unhelpful to understand what's going on because it usually has negative connotations. So populists are bad. There's nothing good that can come from populism, even though there's a long tradition of populism as being a very democratic force. And in political economy, we can think about populism as being about the fact that government should be responsive to the concerns of the people, right? So the fact that it's usually used in such a negative way meant that I really wanted to avoid it because a lot of the movements or forces that I'm looking at in the book are not necessarily so bad or harmful or dangerous, but they are all pitched against a particular way of doing things, which is the system, the set of arrangements which have governed democracy and capitalism over the last 30, 40 years.
All right, so give us some examples. What are the ones that we don't normally think of? We think of Trump, we think of Orban, we think of all the authoritarians, but part of what you're trying to do is broaden the set. So how do you broaden the set?
Well, I mean, this is probably the main reason I didn't want to use the word populism, because people automatically associate it with right-wing authoritarianism, which is something much more specific, right? So very often movements more on the left of the political spectrum are potentially falling into this category of anti-system politics. And I didn't want to give them the label of populism because I didn't want to suggest that parties like Podemos in Spain, which has just pushed through a minimum income guarantee in Spain for the first time in its history, I didn't want to put them in the same basket as Trump or Orban or racist anti-immigrant parties. But also there are other kinds of movements which are against the system, but which don't fall into either far-right or far-left categories, like the Scottish National Party, for example, something close to your heart. But also the Five Stars movement in Italy, which is a really hard movement to define, set up by a comedian, very much pitched against the existing political elite in Italy, without any clear ideology, but very, very decisively against the system. In other words, demanding fundamental change to the way the economy and politics works.
All right, so let's get into this demand for fundamental change. So let's go back to my summary at the start. Your account basically says that 30 years of neoliberalism and the inequalities and fragilities that it's produced over time culminated in the 2008 financial crisis, which was, as we've said many times before, socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. Austerity was the result. And that has led to basically, if you will, a kind of revolt across the political spectrum, left and right, which says that essentially these parties have failed us, they need to go, the system needs to change. So that's a very economistic account. A lot of the stuff that we see on populism, and this could just simply be because they prefer to sample on the right-wing stuff rather than the left-wing stuff, tend to focus on cultural factors. And your account was very interesting precisely because very early on in the book it says, what about culture? And you go, I'm not going there. So why are you not going there?
Well, because the story just doesn't really fit the outcome we're trying to explain. Probably the best example of this approach is a book called Cultural Backlash by Pippa, Norris and Ronald Inglehart, which is a great book. I really recommend reading it after you've read mine. And it details a lot of the changes to public opinion in Western countries over a longish period. And what they find actually is that societies are becoming much more tolerant, more liberal. They're becoming more accepting of migration. They're becoming more accepting of ethnic diversity, of gay marriage, and all of these other kind of bellwether issues for right-wing populists. So it just doesn't fit to say that, you know, now that people have become so tolerant, they're all turning populist because they can't stand immigrants anymore. Just as the data just does not suggest that that would be the case.
So hang on, you're saying that their own data doesn't support their own thesis?
Exactly, yeah. And they end up getting in a little bit of a tangle because, of course, Ronald Inglehart is known for the theory that when societies become so prosperous that immediate economic needs are fulfilled, people can start thinking about more post-material issues, as he calls them. But, of course, now we're in a terrible recession and all of these things come to a head. But at the same time, they don't want to go there. They revert to this idea that it's all about culture. So I just think that it's much more plausible that a long process of increasing economic insecurity and increasing inequality of income and wealth could lead to this kind of political backlash, because that is moving in the right direction. The cultural story is moving in the wrong one.
All right, but you know, one of the cases you have in your book is the United States, and one of the things that scholars in the United States tend to say is, A, you simply can't understand not just Trump, American politics in general, without introducing race as a variable. And the second one is Trump supporters on average are richer than the American average. So how can it be about inequality, and how do you square the circle on that one in your account of the US?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what I'm saying isn't to imply that culture is nothing to do with this. It's certainly true that people who have racist attitudes are more likely to be seduced by the kind of message that Donald Trump has put out there. But at the same time, the idea that, one sort of particular version of this that you hear is, well, you know, the election of Donald Trump is a backlash against the first black president, Barack Obama. But of course, you know, the evidence for that is that the voters that switched to Trump in one particular academic paper that you probably read too, the voters that switched from Obama to Trump in 2016 were more likely to be ones with racist attitudes. Great. that does imply you're more likely to vote for Trump if you're a racist. But why did they vote for Obama in the first place if race was really what was driving their politics? What we need to understand is why race has been activated in the way it has in this particular period, 2016. And of course, when we look beyond the racism of Trump, we see a lot of other stuff which very clearly addresses economic grievances, globalization, the competitive threat of China, and the decline of certain kind of post-industrial areas in the United States and the so-called white working class. That is wrapped up in race, but it isn't a story just about race. It's about race and economics.
So, in some ways, though, your account is less about the damage done by neoliberalism, which is essentially a large increase in precarity, long-term decline, if not or stagnation in wages for large parts of populations, both in Europe and the United States, the whittling away of welfare and labour rights protections. But it's also about how parties on the left that used to traditionally protect these communities effectively gave up doing so. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the story isn't just an economic one. It's also about how democratic institutions have failed to deal with the economic problem. And a big part of that story is why competitive elections have not been enough to give people channels to address their grievances and elect people who will do something to help them. And of course, a big part of this story there is that if all the political parties are signed up to a particular way of doing things, let's just for shorthand call it neoliberal economics, then voters can vote, but it won't make any difference. There might be marginal differences, some of them quite important between political parties, but the underlying system of management of the economy is not going to change if all the parties are signed up to the same model. And that same model has been entrenched kind of across the Western democracies. And I'm not trying to suggest that there's no difference between the way capitalism works in the United States and the way it works in Sweden. And I'm not trying to suggest there's no difference between Tony Blair and David Cameron, to take the British example. But it is true that all of these countries and all of these politicians have been signed up to this kind of pro-market way of thinking about the economy.
So let's delve into that. What are the elements of that? We have governance by technocrats. We have central bank independence. We have the idea that fiscal policy should be subservient to monetary policy, essentially that the economy should be run, if at all, in a kind of managerial way. What was wrong with that? Why was that sort of not the right script for these parties to follow?
Well, obviously I've drawn a lot on your work on this, and partly because this way of doing things has all kinds of consequences which are not so great. And the consequences are particularly not so great for the traditional constituency of parties of what we now these days call the centre-left, which is very telling in itself, right, that we call them centre-left, social democratic, socialist, Labour parties. They have essentially been following policies that have been hugely damaging to their base, in much the same way as the Democrats rushed to free trade and globalization in the 90s in the US was very bad for part of the blue-collar base of the Democratic Party. The same way in which some of the policies followed by Tony Blair's Labour Party in Britain had much the same effect. We're now seeing a backlash in some of these post-industrial areas in Britain, partly because of that. Another great example is Germany, of course, which you know well, which is the Social Democratic Party in Germany in the early 2000s, pushed through a set of reforms which weakened the German welfare state, which liberalized the German labor market, created a lot of low-paid, low-status, low-tenure jobs. And surprise, surprise, the Social Democratic Party in Germany has been losing votes ever since. And it's now down to, I think it's probably about the same level as the far-right AfD. And I think below the Greens in most polls. So doesn't really make sense as a political project either, but certainly it's bad because it's damaging the weakest people in society.
So I had Stephanie Mudge on the podcast a couple of months ago talking about her interpretation of this, which is essentially that as parties evolve over time, they get rid of rabble-rousers, and then after the war, they get rid of they do the Keynesian bit, and then after the Keynesians, they get what she calls finance-friendly economists, strategists and technicians. And they become the people who basically constitute these parties. She gives a very internalist and kind of sociological field account as to how this happened. What's your version of that, though? Why did these parties do this if it was so obviously damaging?
I think that it's a great book, and I think there's a lot to be said for what's happening in terms of the changes in personnel. So there's also a great paper by Tom O'Grady of University College London on this, about how the kind of traditional trade unionist MP in the Labour Party in Britain has been superseded by the kind of Oxbridge-educated think tanker and special advisor kind of trajectory. But I think we need to look a bit beyond that, because, of course, political parties they've always had this tendency to elitism. So Roberto Michels identified this 100 years ago, right? The iron law of oligarchy. But in most of the 20th century, these parties also had roots on the ground. They had grassroots presence. They had, party branches in every neighborhood. They were attached to trade unions in the workplace. And they built big structures which helped ensure that the leaderships could never entirely detach themselves from the interests of their base. And over the last 50 years or so, that has been in decline. If you look at the evidence is clear. Party membership across Western democracies has been declining for 40, 50 years. And the end result of that is that there's nothing stopping these technocrats taking over centre-left parties. There is no resistance from the base anymore because the parties kind of disappeared and withered away.
So beyond withering away, though, I just want to stay on with this for a moment. If you kind of like try and capture the middle all the time, you're trying to get this minimum winning coalition, if you want to put it that way, and they're not sort of tied to you in any way ideologically or emotionally or through supporting social institutions, then that creates a very, very fragile base for any political party to operate on. Is that part of the reason that the populist moment has happened now, to refer back to that term? In a sense, has that type of party system opened the door to these opportunists?
Yeah, not only because parties became detached from voters. So, there's lots of evidence in lots of different countries that people are they're less likely to join a political party, but they're also less likely to feel represented by it or to trust the people in charge, right? So we see this detachment. But in this context, party elites, they recognize that they're vulnerable if their voters are no longer so committed to them. So what they do is they close ranks. They use a series of sort of institutional fixes and techniques to protect themselves from the risk that outsider parties, challenger parties, could rush in and take their space. So they sign checks for themselves. They pass laws on public financing of political parties to give them a financial advantage against any outside challenge. They sometimes manipulate rules on candidacies, and electoral rules are maintained which are going to make it harder for small parties to gain a foothold in the system, and so on. And what the irony is that in Britain, the UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which is the first kind of battering ram of Brexit, they managed to work their way into the British political system in large part because they were able to get elected to the European Parliament and finally get their hands on public funding to pay their bills. And that's the way they were able to kind of gate crash the British democratic system. So, this cartel system that Katz and Mer described it as held up for quite a while as people got more and more dissatisfied. But of course, you get the global financial crisis come in. Everybody suddenly is suffering. Their wages are going down. Their savings are not growing anymore. People are indebted, can't pay off their debts, and they see a closed elite of politicians not really doing anything to help, and they say, right, that's enough. I'm going to vote for something else, whatever.
So go back to the US example for a while. So we shouldn't just be looking at Trump. We should also be looking at Bernie Sanders. We should be looking at AOC, right? In a way, perhaps the rot has gone even deeper than you acknowledge in your book. And I just want to sound you out and see how far you would go along this line. My interpretation of the Republican Party is not just now that they're beholden to Trump. It's almost a bit like with Corbyn, with what happened with New Labour. No one expected this guy to win. And when he walked in, he found an empty building. And then he just filled it basically with himself and his own followers. And that was it. The revolution was done. And it's similar with the Republican Party. The mainstream Republicans are nowhere to be found. Never Trumpers will never get a job. basically he is the party at this point. And what we see in the Democratic Party is the one thing that Democratic mainstream elites fear more than a Trump victory is a wealth tax. And that's why anybody with a hint of anti-systemness to them, be it Bernie, AOC, or even Elizabeth Warren, is to be stopped. Thus Joe Biden. And that strikes me as very much like the SPD. They will not do a deal with the left-wing party, Die Linke. They will not do a deal with the Greens. And so they basically shrink over time and continually lose. But the insiders don't mind because they've still got jobs. Is that fair enough?
Well, it's a very harsh assessment, but there's certainly more than a bit of truth to it, isn't there? I mean, I guess we would see if Sanders had ever managed to get through, because they tried their damnedest to make sure that didn't happen, right? For all kinds of reasons, not just to do with electability. We've had the same kind of story in Britain with the Labour Party and Corbyn. I mean, I don't know if you followed the leaked report that came out shortly before Corbyn finally left the leader's office in the Labour Party, which revealed that a lot of people in the party's central office had been actively conspiring to prevent Labour from maximising its vote in the 2017 election, to such an extent that actually they were channeling funds away from marginal seats that Labour could win to protect right-wing MPs who they wanted to make sure could hold their seats. So yes, there's plenty of evidence of this kind of very entrenched oligarchy trying to protect itself, even at the expense of their own voters, and even at the expense of losing elections and keeping, even more and more extremist right-wing parties in power. And the SPD, same story.
All right, so let's think about this then. The US and the UK kind of have a similar-ish model as to what's going on, of takeovers of hollowed-out parties or vote decline over the long term. Germany's vote decline over the long term. How would your framework explain France, where you did have rising right-wing populism? Left-wing populism didn't seem to really catch on that much. And suddenly, basically, the entire party system collapses, and one bloke shows up in the middle and says, I'm a centrist, vote for me. How does that work in this framework?
Well, I mean, a lot of it fits pretty well, because, I mean, the anti-system left in France actually has done pretty well. So Macron was 2017, I think, the presidential election. If you sum up all of the kind of communist and Trotskyite and other left candidates together in the first round of the presidential election in France, they sum to about 23-24% of the vote, which is huge. It's just they're all fragmented across different candidacies. Right. The French communists usually put up 4 or 5 candidates in any presidential election, which makes it hard to get through, right? And a similar story with the centre-left party, the Socialist Parti Socialiste in France. They're down to, 8% in the presidential election? Practically disappeared from having the presidency. They were the party in control of the Élysée Palace for 5 years. They did basically nothing. They changed nothing. And their punishment was they were wiped out. Now, of course, that creates an opportunity for parties on the left, but as I've just described, the French left is pretty incapable of putting up a viable candidate. And so it opens up a hole, right? The right is increasingly represented by a very far-right party that doesn't even have that much sympathy in the French business class, right? And the left is fragmented and the centre-left is very weak. So there's a huge gap appearing in the middle. And of course, Macron is not really truly an outsider or an independent. He'd been in the socialist government under Hollande. But of course, he's the neoliberal side of that centre-left establishment. And I think what happened in France can probably only happen in France, because it's one of the few cases where you have the direct election of a presidency, who then usually can get himself parliamentary majority elected too. So I think France is a little bit of an unusual case. I don't want to ad hoc my way out of this, but I think the Macron solution is a fairly unusual one. But the same pattern of polarization and fragmentation is what we see in other places.
All right, so I want to concentrate on some of the really unique contributions of the book. You don't just talk about the neoliberalization of the economy as being fragilizing and the root cause of all this stuff. You actually have a term of art, neoliberal democracy. What do you mean by that?
Okay, just to confess, this isn't my term. As Colin Lees dreamt up that concept. And it's the idea really that in a neoliberal system, of course, if you if you take the view that markets not only are the best way of organizing the economy, but they need to be protected from political interference. Because if the public choice school always argues that democracy is a big threat to the market system because voters will vote for nice things rather than the just desert of the market system. What they should get, yeah. And so neoliberal democracy is really a system in which the market is protected from democracy. So it means a democratic system which can actually enact any change. So some of the things you were talking about earlier, like central bank independence, are great examples of neoliberal democracy. Supranational rules set by non-majoritarian institutions. Non-majoritarian is a political science term to mean not elected and not accountable institutions. So like the European Court of Justice when it comes to things like product market rules and labour market rules, or obviously the ECB or the Fed or the Bank of England when it comes to monetary policy. So in essence, it's democracy without democracy. It's the kind of trappings of democracy, but without any of the real without any possibility of a popular majority really bringing about a change to the market system.
So let me throw a wild question your way then, having worked down that tunnel, because I was thinking about this as you were saying this, and also when I was reading the book. Many people say, with more than some justification, that President Trump is just another neoliberal. He's just a populist in rhetoric, right? But he does actually beat up on central banks. He does withdraw from these non-representative institutions. Is that, in a sense, something that you could point to say, actually, he does have a kind of anti-neoliberal side? He doesn't. Yeah. He just hates these institutions.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes with Trump, it's hard to see where he's going because he his rhetoric is obviously jumps around quite a lot. But I think one of the real misunderstandings of Trump, especially over here, I think, is that, underneath the chaotic rhetoric, there is quite a clear political line there, which is it's anti-globalization, it's pro-market, but it's markets embedded in a particular view of society, right? So, there's a social order that he wants to protect. It might be a racialized social order. It's not an egalitarian social order. But it is a social order in which the market should not be allowed to wipe out the livelihoods of particular groups which have been hard done by and which Trump would like to protect. Obviously, there are lots of other groups he doesn't care for. But it is a vision of society in which the state should have the capacity to shape the market to achieve political and social ends.
And that's very un-neoliberal, and that's basically, in a sense, to bring this back around, why this is an anti-system moment in this. Because one of the things you note in your book, and you do this statistically, the evidence is quite robust, is that when you look at the party platforms and speeches and pronouncements and actual policies of all these different anti-system parties, none of them fall into the neoliberal box. They're all, doesn't matter if they're left or right, they're all much more pro-state, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I took this data from what's called the Comparative Manifestos Project. So it's a way of trying to score the political positions of political parties at elections all across the Western democracies ever since the war. So it's a huge data set. And what you can get from that is that there have been sort of clear shifts in the kind of positions parties take. You can also observe in this data that social democratic or centre-left parties have increasingly abandoned economic interventionism over the post-war period. It started to come back a bit in the last decade or so, but they'd kind of given up on the idea that government could try and shape the market in the way we were just describing Trump aspiring to do. So you can see in this data that the anti-system parties, whether they're on the right, Trumpism, Le Pen, or whether on the left, Sanders, Corbyn, Podemos in Spain, and so on, they're very different on what we call the social cultural dimension of policy, things to do with, racial equality, gay rights, and so on. But they are very similar, actually, in economic policy, in that they're all arguing for a return to the state, for a return to government, having a role in shaping the economy. And in some ways, they're actually really rather similar. If you look at the British example, Jeremy Corbyn was fairly unenthusiastic about the European Union, partly because the European Union has strict competition laws that mean that governments can't bail out failing companies and they can't have an industrial policy. Well, here we have a new government under Boris Johnson, who before the pandemic had all kinds of plans for industrial policy in Britain to try and revive the post-industrial North. So there's actually, there's a strong connection. These parties are way apart on all kinds of other things, but when it comes to the economy, they definitely have a view that the government should get involved. So it's not neoliberal democracy. It is actually a form of democracy. It's a form of a government which allows people to take back control, to use a phrase,
to use the Brexit phrase,
of the market economy.
So why do you think it is that most other scholars playing in this area really haven't made that connection? What is it about those other analyses whereby really nobody else points this out? Why are you the only person that's noticed this?
Shall I make myself unpopular here?
Yeah, go on.
I think the problem is that we both inhabit a world which, is geared to not understanding this, right? We are in prestigious academic institutions which have benefited from globalization, which have benefited from some aspects of neoliberalism, even though many people in our universities would like neoliberalism to be mitigated in all kinds of ways.
Many six-figure salaries have been written about how bad neoliberalism is.
Exactly. And I think that just prejudices us a little from seeing the way this might look at the sharp end. And, there was a great example of this. Andy Haldane, who's not an academic, is Bank of England technocrat and someone you know well, a very, very honest, I think, analyst of the economy in Britain, and he was talking about how a few years back he went up to Sheffield in the north of England, very, very depressed region, to talk about the economy, and he'd been looking at some data beforehand that his assistants in the Bank of England had been poring over, and he was thinking, well, things are not looking too bad, their economy's recovering, employment's in the right direction, and he got to Sheffield and he suddenly realised that everything was terrible, that people were desperate. And I think in universities we suffer a bit from some of this, that we don't really see, we don't get out there enough to see what things are like at the sharp end.
One other, I think, unique contribution of the book is that you highlight how creditor-debtor politics, both within countries and between countries, are incredibly important in understanding this. Many people will go along with yes, it's the inequality, stupid, but you're actually saying, no, it's actually the debtor-creditor relationships in countries and between them that's driving a lot of this. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, and with the caveat that, to be honest, I still don't think I've got to the bottom of this, because we have a real problem in that creditor-debtor dynamics are very strongly correlated with patterns of inequality. So it's really hard to tease out what's an effect of inequality and what's an effect of being on the wrong side of the creditor-debtor relation. But, at the country level, what we see really clearly is that countries that were lending to the rest of the world on net before the financial crisis did an awful lot better coming out of the financial crisis. So the hit to incomes in those countries was far, far less. Some of them returned to growth, albeit not great growth, but still growth fairly quickly. But the countries that were running big current account deficits just before the financial crisis got hammered. Britain and the United States were actually two of the ones that suffered least, but even there was a real hit to incomes. But in countries like Greece, Ireland, Italy, Spain, it was a total disaster. So these are all countries where we've seen really, really significant backlash in the politics of the last decade, that we've seen anti-system parties doing really well. We've seen completely new political forces emerging, like Podemos in Spain, like Syriza in Greece, on the left in particular, pushing for a reversal of austerity and for the government to do more to protect the incomes of the people at the bottom end who've suffered the most. So in a way, there's an income distribution story, which is some countries have had more generous welfare states and they've been more able to protect the population from the effects of the financial crisis. But it's also that some countries were in a better position in terms of their indebtedness to the rest of the world before the crisis. And the more indebted you were, the more trouble you got into. And it just happens that the countries which were best placed on the creditor-debtor relation were also the ones with the strongest welfare states. So,
right. So how does this shake out in terms of anti-system politics? What type of politics do debtors produce? Which ones do creditors produce?
Well, that depends a lot on the patterns of welfare state and labour market organisation. So, I mean, in Britain and America, you have a really tough crisis after the financial collapse. You've got median incomes declining for a short period. But of course, the way that plays out across the income distribution varies a huge amount. So people at the bottom really take a huge hit. People at the top recover relatively quickly. And in Britain and America, we've seen actually backlash on both sides of the political spectrum. So you see, we see movements on the left we've already talked about, Corbyn and Sanders, but you also see the kind of right-wing version of anti-system politics in Trump and Brexit too. But if we look in Europe, the debtor countries of Southern Europe, of the Eurozone, Spain, Greece, Italy, Portugal, they have very different kind of patterns of income distribution. They have quite high inequality, but the way in which risk is shared out amongst different parts of the population is completely different. And what you can see looking at patterns of income growth in those countries after the crisis is that the people who really take a hammering are the young. Young people are less protected by the welfare state. There's very, very high unemployment. And so these are the people likely to push for some kind of anti-system response. And because what we know about cultural change from Norris and Inglehart is that younger people are much more tolerant on the whole of migration and of cultural diversity, these people are not going to go for a far-right solution to an economic problem. They're going to push instead for some kind of debt forgiveness at the Eurozone level. They're going to push for welfare reforms. And we've seen that. I think I mentioned it earlier, but Spain passed yesterday a reform
basic income.
Basic income.
Yeah.
And that is a result of a left anti-system party, Podemos, actually finding its way into government.
So I know you don't have the data in this for the book, but just conjecture for me. Is right-wing populism age skewed to the point that basically it's a generational effect, and once the generation passes, the potential for it declines? Or is it a cohort effect, whereby as you get older, you become more conservative, and that base is always going to be there? What's your hunch?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about this again in 10 years' time. If we're both, Trump or Brexit supporters by then, we will know that, it's an over time rather than a cohort effect. The thing is, this varies a lot across countries. So what I found is that older voters in Southern Europe were actually more inclined to keep voting for the standard mainstream establishment parties. And that, part of the reason for that is that they're the ones best protected by the welfare state. So right. The age divide is seen in Southern Europe, but it doesn't play out in the same way as it does in the US and the UK, which are the two countries where the age skew is most clear. It varies. There are countries in Europe where far-right parties do have significant support amongst the young as well. So the National Front in France, and the PVV in Netherlands, I believe, are not quite so age-skewed as maybe Trump and Brexit are. But there is certainly a pattern whereby if we look at this, the positions that voters have on cultural issues suggest that the anti-migrant, far-right xenophobic response is always going to appeal more to older and especially less educated voters.
One question in closing. The shock of the COVID recession, if not depression. We don't know when it's over. We don't know if we're coming out of it. But we see a kind of rally around the flag effect amongst mainstream parties just now. But as people get more and more annoyed with the lockdown, is this a portent that we're going to see more anti-system party behaviour as we come out of this?
And what's really interesting about this is that initially, and I think it's already starting to change, actually, certainly in Britain, there's evidence of that. Initially, the response that people have is that, despite all the evidence, they don't really trust governments as much as they used to. They really want to trust their governments now because everybody's fearful. So they think, okay, these people have got it under control. They're locking down. They know what they're doing. Yes, I'll go with the government of the day. And of course, in some countries, the government of the day is an anti-system government. I mean, Boris Johnson's government in Britain very much emerges out of an anti-system movement. Also in Italy, Conte's government in Italy, Conte was part of the Five Stars movement. So again, very much an anti-system politician. They've both benefited from increased support in the crisis. But I think where things will really become clear is when it becomes less of a public health problem and more of an economic problem, which might happen pretty soon. At the moment, we got both, right? But the full implications of this economic shutdown are going to be clearer and clearer as the year goes on, and you can expect governments to become more and more unpopular. So where we have mainstream parties in government, you would expect that would give a fillip to the anti-system parties. But the really interesting thing is to see where anti-system parties are in there already and are coping probably not terribly well with this crisis. What is the effect? Do people revert to the establishment, or do they go for a different type of anti-system force? My guess is that if you revert to the establishment, you're going to very quickly be disappointed. So if the outcome in the US is Biden wins the election, I think anybody who was contemplating voting for Sanders and a lot of people who supported Trump and lost are going to be really furious very quickly. There's no sense in which we're going to return to neoliberal democracy as a satisfactory way of managing the economy, not until we get growth back. And there are all kinds of reasons for thinking growth is never going to come back to some extent that is going to do the job. So we need to fundamentally change the way the economy works. And I think, my position, I'm sure you would agree with this as well, is that in one way or another, that's going to involve government taking much more responsibility for the way the economy works and getting much more involved in distributing investment and opportunity and giving people security. And there's no you can do that in the old neoliberal system. So things are going to have to change. And the question is, who's going to be able to deliver that?
Which begs one final question I don't expect you to respond to, but I'll just close off with this. Well, that all depends on the quality of your government. If you have a state that you actually trust that seems to know what they're doing, for example, the Danes, then you're perfectly willing to hand over 50% of your income and let them provide public goods. If you're actually in the United States or the United Kingdom, there's pretty good reasons for not believing that these people know what the hell they're doing, and you don't want to hand them that chunk of change. That perhaps goes some way to explaining the politicization that's out there.
Yeah, that's true, but it's also true that there's no way around this that doesn't involve the government, becoming the buyer and seller and lender of last resort, right? There's a huge chunk disappeared from the economy, and you don't get that back by just the government sitting back, doing some fix with negative interest rates or something and saying, let the market sort it out. That's not going to be enough. So it's going to involve the government getting involved whether or not we really think they're up to it.
But what if they get involved with another healthy bout of austerity?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the real test in Britain, because in Britain, the initial response was really very fast and very, very, very thorough, right? They threw money at the problem, but now they're already starting to think, right, we've got to end this lockdown now because we can't afford to keep this going for much longer. And already there's the trial balloons going out about austerity. But of course, this government was elected on the back of, well, we're going to spend more money on the NHS because we have a Brexit dividend. And we've got that coming down the road.
Yeah.
So
it's going to be very hard to pivot and turn that back into an austerity story, isn't it?
They're going to have to spend money. There's no way we're going through another 10 years of austerity when the last 10 years produced a level of debt which is going to be, considerably higher than what we started with. We didn't reduce debt. We're going to be at 100% debt to GDP ratio in Britain. In a couple of months. And just to close, there's this great bit of data I saw yesterday, I can't remember where, which was that popularity of austerity in Britain. Austerity was on net unpopular in Britain between 2010 and 2013. Then it became more popular between 2013 and about 2016, and then less popular again. So why is there a turning point in 2013? Easy. They eased back on the austerity.
Right, they stopped doing it.
They stopped doing it.
So the idea became, but they kept talking about it, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
People love the idea of austerity, but they don't like doing it so much.
Yeah, so long as it doesn't apply to them. All right, Jonathan, we could talk forever, but unfortunately we have to bring this to a close. It is now, 5 o'clock your time?
10 to 5, yep.
10 to 5. Well, that means in 10 minutes you can go have a gin and tonic.
Yeah, okay, will do.
All the best. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
This episode of the Rhodes Centre podcast was produced by Dan Richards. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. If you like us, rate us on iTunes and help others find the podcast as well. For more information, go to watson.brown.edu/Rhodes. Thanks for listening.